Welcome everyone for this LCAP lecture, Leuven, Colloquia and Ancient Platonism. And today we have a very distinguished guest, Professor Lloyd Gerson from the University of Toronto. And if I may say so, Lloyd has a kind of unique position among scholars working on Plato and Platonism, in that he, in his works, defines the essence of Platonism and thinks through it in all its consequences in a radical, fundamental, and original manner, in a manner that also shows the historical importance of Platonism and confirms it. So he has been very busy publishing books, writing books. So he has worked a lot on Plotinus, is responsible for both the old and the new companion, Cambridge companion to Plotinus, is responsible, coordinated a team of translators and himself translated the entire Plotinus, is the editor of the Cambridge History of Philosophy in Late Antiquity, and then has published several very well-known and well-regarded books. I mentioned From Plato to Platonism, Aristotle and Other Platonists. We just discussed one of my favorite titles. Ancient Epistemology, much earlier, Knowing Persons. And now there's an upcoming book which will be published early next year. And today's talk has to do with that book. So the next book will be Plato's Moral Realism, due in the spring of 2023. But today, he will talk on the metaphysical foundation of Plato's ethics. And before we start, I should remind the people online that this lecture will be recorded. If they don't want to be recorded, they should switch their cameras off. Yeah, please, Lloyd, go ahead.
Thank you very much on the kind introduction.
Switching.
Thank you, Jan, for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here. This paper is a kind of précis or a trailer for the book that's coming out next year. I hope it makes sense. Not so very long ago in the history of philosophy, one would have thought it unnecessary to argue that Plato's ethics had a metaphysical foundation, or even what exactly that foundation is. Alas, this is not the case today. From Hans-Georg Gadamer's fatuous pronouncement, Platon war kein Platoniker, to Gregory Velasquez's equally misguided, Socrates was no metaphysician. Numerous 20th century scholars of ancient philosophy have busied themselves trying, with increasing implausibility, simply to ignore the evidence along with all well-established canons of historical scholarship, and to construct an account of Platonic ethics that either saves it from being a betrayal of exquisite Socratic insights or from being an embarrassing misstep, preparing the way for the more sophisticated ethics found in Aristotle. Henry Sidgwick, in his highly influential History of Ethics, wrote, "The ethics of Plato cannot properly be treated as a finished result, but rather as a continual movement from the position of Socrates towards the more complex and articulate system of Aristotle, except that there are ascetic and mystical suggestions in some parts of Plato's teaching which find no counterpart in Aristotle, and which, in fact, disappear from Greek philosophy soon after Plato's death until they are revived and fantastically developed in Neo-Pythagoreanism and Neoplatonism. If a philosopher maintains that Plato, unfortunately, betrayed or obfuscated the sharp psychological insights contained in the so-called Socratic paradoxes, or that he did not appreciate the liberating advancement made by Aristotle when he severed practical or normative science from metaphysics, that philosopher makes no historical mistake and only needs to be addressed, if one is so inclined, on philosophical grounds. But when a soi-disant scholar of ancient philosophy declares that Plato had no intention of situating his ethical philosophy within a systematic metaphysical framework. Such a travesty should not go unanswered. I, no more than anyone else, have any idea what was in Plato's mind at the time of his writing any dialogue. But at least I can read the dialogues, and I can read the works of those who were with Plato, and not only read these dialogues, but were also part of the oral tradition that flowed out from the academy. And my reading, identical to that of many in this room, no doubt, and to many others who are not, leads to the historical conclusion that Plato's ethical philosophy, as presented in the dialogues and as transmitted throughout the history of Platonism and beyond, is inseparable from his systematic metaphysics. One plausible motive for discounting the metaphysics when thinking about Plato's ethics is having embraced an absurd interpretation of the metaphysics. There is, unfortunately, far too much material here to survey. Let me mention only a few examples. In R.E. Allen's Studies in Plato's Metaphysics in 1965, which purports to be a collection of state-of-the-art works on Plato's metaphysics by some of the leading lights in ancient philosophy in the English-speaking world at the time, including Harold Chernis, G.L. Owen, John Ackerell, and so on. There is not one single mention of what Plato in the Republic calls the unhypothetical first principle of all. One might have reasonably expected that any treatment of Plato's metaphysics would at least include a mention of what Plato takes to be the starting point for metaphysics, and, we must add, without which intelligible reality is said to be unavailable to us. That is, it would not exist, it would not be knowable. A similar but much more recent omission is to be found in Verity Hart's essay, Plato's Metaphysics, in Gale Fine's The Oxford Handbook of Plato in 2011, an essay which purports to be a kind of record of the state of the art in Plato scholarship today. Moving on to those who at least nominally do mention the unhypothetical first principle of all, we find in Alan Silverman's entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Plato's middle period metaphysics and epistemology, the chapter he wrote, the claim that the idea of the good is, I quote, best regarded as having the status of first among equals, unquote. One may be forgiven for wondering that if the good is the first of all, in what sense exactly is it equal to the others? I conclude this brief survey with examples from two very distinguished scholars of ancient philosophy, both of whom appear to want to offer a serious interpretation of the idea of the good. Terry Penner, in an essay and a book entirely devoted to the idea of the good, says that the good is actually the form of personal advantage. So, in answer to the question of why one should be just, Socrates or Plato would say, because you want what is really good for yourself, and what is really good for yourself is advantage, which is equivalent to happiness. We are supposed to find plausible the claim that the unhypothetical first principle of all, that which is beyond ousia, and is the cause of the being and ousia of all of the forms, and is that which makes all the forms knowable, is advantage. Finally, Sarah Brody says in her unfortunate last book, Plato's Sun-like Good, Dialectic in the Republic, 2021, that the idea of the good is just an interrogative, an overriding question put to anyone who wants to do good. The idea of the good is just the question, what is the good thing to do? And the answer will be to produce virtuous people and families and states. I could go on and on, I'm sorry to say. My central point is not the deficiencies in some Anglo-American scholarship on Plato's metaphysics, but that these deficiencies bleed into the interpretation of Plato's ethics, especially if, as I shall argue, it turns out to be the case that the ethics rests upon the metaphysics. This argument, however, naturally depends on getting the metaphysics right. Plato is a moral realist. A moral realist maintains that there are truth makers for moral propositional claims, broadly speaking. Thus, to say that something is good or bad or right or wrong or ought not to be done is, for the moral realist, to commit oneself to there being something like facts in the real world that make these propositions true or false. By contrast, an anti-moral realist will maintain that there are no such facts. Accordingly, the putative moral propositions are either nonsensical or universally false. The first view typically holds that these propositions are merely expressions of one's feeling or wishes. The second holds that, though these propositions are false, they have some meaning or value in exhorting people to some sort of behavior thought to be socially desirable. Not surprisingly, moral realists differ widely in their views of what the supposed moral facts are. Among Plato scholars, there is practically universal agreement that Plato is a moral realist. I here leave out of account that small minority of scholars who maintain that we cannot tell whether Plato is or is not a moral realist because, since Plato does not speak in propria persona in the dialogues, we do not know his views on the matter. This is not the time to address this position. I've done so elsewhere. So have many others. Things truly get interesting when one begins to inquire as to what these so-called moral facts are for Plato. Having tried to execute due diligence in the research for my book on Plato's moral realism, and reading much or most, if not the material that has been written on the subject, I can report with honest bewilderment that much of the literature divides between those who, though they are writing on Plato's ethics, say nothing on the matter, and those who offer some weak interpretation along the lines that Plato thinks that his claims in moral philosophy are true because of vague facts about human nature. So, for example, that it is better to suffer than to do wrong is true because of the way that human beings are built. Doing wrong is something that ill befits our soul, just as unhealthy food ill befits our bodies. I say I find these responses bewildering because there is, in fact, no doubt whatsoever that what the correct answer is to the question of the truth maker for Plato's moral realism. It is the superordinate idea of the good that is the sole foundation of Plato's ethics. I shall in a bit turn to the texts of the dialogues themselves to demonstrate this. But let me reflect for a moment on why there is such a major disconnect between the texts and the interpretations, especially, I regret to say, in the English-speaking world. The least damning explanation I can come up with for why this is so is that the idea of the good does not seem to be, at least on the face of it, anything remotely like a practical guide to ethics. To say that you must do good and avoid evil is hardly a counsel that one could reasonably follow, much less build an ideal city on. So perhaps thinking that among the Socratic paradoxes and Plato's sophisticated psychology of human action, there is a more promising account to be had regarding the truth makers for moral propositions. The idea of the good is simply set aside, a mere emblem of commitment to realizing virtue both in private and in public life. As history of philosophy, this interpretation is obviously inadequate, even absurd, although at least it seems to arise from an authentic desire to read and understand the text. But in my part of the world, a much more common and pernicious approach is the following. Plato's moral philosophy has its roots in Socratic philosophy. Socratic philosophy is innocent of metaphysics. Because Socratic philosophy is innocent of metaphysics, a valorization of Socratic ethics can be unburdened of any attachment to Platonic metaphysics and all its attendant embarrassments. Here, bad philosophy is added to bad scholarship. There is no evidence whatsoever that any of the dialogues contain something that can be isolated as Socratic philosophy, even conceding that Socrates was a major influence on Plato. Indeed, the evidence we have is entirely on the other side. Aristotle testifies that Plato held what we now call a two-world metaphysics, ek neu, suggesting almost certainly that he held this view prior to writing any dialogue. He held this view starting from his youth. Only one caught in the grips of some ideology could maintain that. If this is true, then Plato was simply concealing his metaphysics when he expressed Socratic philosophy. The bad scholarship is exacerbated by bad philosophy in the predictable interpretation that follows. The truth makers for Socrates' paradoxical moral claims are just facts about human nature. It is conceded that there may be exceptions, but these are few, and for the most part, it is simply prudent to be virtuous. Here, the rejection of historical scholarship leads even a fine philosopher like Terry Pennard to make Platonic ethics pure prudentialism, as he puts it. You will no doubt notice that pure prudentialism is explicitly the position taken by Epicurus, the arch enemy of Platonism. I would suggest that if your study of Plato leads you to make Plato an Epicurean in ethics, then you really ought to reconsider the assumptions that have led you to this manifest absurdity. In Republic, the governing question is whether or not it pays to be a just person. Glaucon and Erymanthus urge upon Socrates the Herculean task of showing not only that being a just person is intrinsically more desirable than being an unjust person, but that the consequences of doing so are superior as well. Moreover, it needs to be shown that a just person who appears to everyone else to be unjust and is treated accordingly has a better life than an unjust person who appears to be just and is also treated accordingly. By the end of Book 4 of Republic, we get an answer to the first part of the challenge. Justice is psychical health, and psychical health is as intrinsically desirable as bodily health. It is odd, though perhaps understandable given the above, that many scholars think that the challenge is actually met by the end of Book 4, even though we're not even halfway through the dialogue, and philosophy has not even been mentioned yet. But Book 5, 6, and 7 bring in the metaphysical heavy artillery, and if one is focused on not spoiling Socratic ethics with Platonic metaphysics, then perhaps it is best to mark Books 5 and onward as mere Platonic excrescences on the this-worldly moral realism of Socrates. This approach obviously has attained some measure of respectability, and it has countless variations. But to show that psychical health is a good alongside physical health is not much of an achievement at all. Many of Socrates' interlocutors, antipathetic to everything he says, could admit as much without any hesitation. Who doesn't value psychical health? But the demonstration of the intrinsic goodness of something that everyone knows is good is not much of an achievement. Virtually all moral dilemmas and moral crises arise, surely, from conflicts among goods. And what Socrates needs to show is that when there is such a conflict, say, between preserving one's physical well-being by escaping from prison and preserving one's psychical well-being by allowing oneself to be executed, one ought unhesitatingly to choose the latter. And in fact, the rest of the Republic is devoted exactly to showing that. Socrates says that the study of the good is the greatest study. It is the good that makes just things and other useful things actually become useful or beneficial, praesima and ophelima. Further, he says that knowledge of the good is the means to human happiness and the explanation, the idea, for everything right and beautiful. Finally, he says that no one can act wisely, either in private or in public, without seeing the good. It is the idea of the good and only the idea of the good that provides the foundation for the moral claims that Plato has Socrates make. These are indeed metaphysical claims, and they are inseparable from Plato's account of the truth makers for his moral realism. One can respect the scholar or philosopher who thinks that Plato has gone wrong here in making these claims. It is more difficult to respect one who, as a matter of principle, simply ignores the evidence that this is Plato's view and that there is in fact an enormous amount of historical evidence to explain what Plato means when he puts the idea of the good at the center of its philosophy. A common complaint among those who at least concede that prima facie, there is some reason to believe that Plato's ethics has a metaphysical foundation, that is the good, beyond ousia, does not appear to be of any practical value at all. How can an exhortation to do good be taken seriously, much less as the central moral claim by a great philosopher? If good is universal, then it is not possible that something, say, some action, should be good for A at the same time that it is not good for B, that it is good for A. The obvious parallels are found in the truths of mathematics. Another way to put this is to say that if the good is instantiated here and now, it is odious to add for me to the proposition that represents the good state of affairs. Thus, if benevolent kingship is good for Athens, then it is true, but also needs no saying, that it is good for me, an Athenian citizen, that a benevolent king rule. More interesting and related to the role of the good is illuminating the Socratic paradoxes. If it is good that I be punished for my wrongdoing, then it is good for me that I be punished for my wrongdoing. Conversely, if it is good for me that I obtain something or do something, then we can infer that it is good, simpliciter, that this occur, and therefore good for everyone else. How does this logical point about the universality of good yield a heuristic? If I am right in believing that, say, just deeds are good owing to the idea of the good, then I can infer that they are good for me. Similarly, I can infer that it is bad for me to do an unjust deed. Then, my doing an unjust deed can never be in my interest. Plato surely believes this on any account of his ethics, but on the prudentialist account, it does not follow that doing just deeds is in everyone's interest, even if justice, like all of the virtues, is a species of perfection. Thus, I can never achieve my good by being unjust to anyone else. Clearly, knowledge of what justice is crucial to the task of being just and of benefiting oneself. But this knowledge is only dispositive in determining action on behalf of my good if the form of justice participates in the superordinate idea of the good, which is the sole object of my will. Suppose that knowledge of what justice is includes minimally knowledge that intentionally harming an innocent person cannot constitute a just deed. If that is so, the heuristic indicates that one refrained from aggressing against anyone. Needless to say, agreeing to this would amount to a huge concession on the part of a tyrant. His devotion to the idea of life as a zero-sum game leads him to think that his own good can often only be advanced at the expense of others. Let us dig a bit deeper for a more problematic case. Someone employing a utilitarian calculus might argue that either A, if the greatest happiness of the greatest number is attained, then injustice done to the few is good, or that B, if the greatest happiness of the greatest number is attained, then no injustice is thereby done, whatever is in fact done to a few. It seems that on the basis of the universality of the good, Plato would reject decisively both alternatives. The first is rejected in Socrates' absolutist prohibition of injustice in Crito. The rejection of the second alternative follows from Socrates' refutation of Thrasymachus's definition of justice as the advantage of the stronger. This claim is rejected for all cases of the stronger, including the majority in a democracy. Attaining advantage for the majority presumably entails disadvantage for the minority, that is, the weaker. Otherwise, it would be for the advantage of all. According to Thrasymachus, the advantage of the majority, if it is stronger, is just for all. Also, according to Thrasymachus, there is a sharp contrast between seeking one's own benefit and the good of another. The rejection of these alternatives as mutually exclusive by Socrates entails the rejection of be above. If this is so, here is a strong, albeit negative, heuristic based on the universality of the good. This heuristic is also sharply circumscribed, since the possibility of doing something apparently good that has adverse consequences for someone sometimes is considerable. And the greater is the good that one aims to do, the greater is the chance of bringing about those consequences. In the face of this, one might attempt various strategies. For example, one might introduce degrees of goodness. So one doesn't calculate whether doing something to A has or has not a bad effect on B, but whether bringing about the combined result for A and B is, on balance, a greater good than not doing so. In other words, one tries to contextualize the effects of acting and shape the demands of virtuous behavior accordingly. Alternatively, one might introduce a doctrine of unintended consequences or double effect. According to such a doctrine, if doing something good to A has the unintended effect of producing something bad for B, then this does not count as a failure of virtue. Admittedly, both of these strategies are fraught with possibilities for abuse. It should also be noted, however, that truly unintended side effects of one's behavior, if they are unforeseeable, cannot, ex hypothesis, be part of the calculation regarding doing good and avoiding evil. But often, and especially at the political rather than the personal level, unintended side effects are reasonably foreseeable. At this level, it is difficult to see how an absolutist prohibition of wrongdoing would not be violated. The cascading consequences of behavior and the circumscription of the first heuristic suggests a certain skepticism about instantiating the good, or at least trying to do so via laws or rubrics. Understandably, Plato hoped that a philosopher with knowledge of the good would be best placed to make circumstantial judgments about how the good should be brought about case by case. Yet the prospect of success in this endeavor diminishes as the potentially affected group grows in size. The second heuristic for the instantiation of the good follows from the necessary, absolute, or unqualified simplicity of the unhypothetical first principle of all, and from its being identified with the idea of the good. As Plato says in Republic, the virtuous person becomes one out of many. There is, of course, much more that can be said about the evidence for Plato's identification of the good with the one, and the almost complete inattention to this evidence, especially on the part of those who deny the metaphysical foundation of Plato's ethics. For now, it should suffice to indicate that unification according to kind, what I call integrative unity, is a standalone criterion of goodness for Plato, even though its effective implementation depends on having at hand definitions of the natures whose unity is sought, including species of living things and forms of association, like a state or a family. In nature, integrative unity maps the steps from endowment to achievement, from the kind of thing one is by nature to the fulfillment of that nature. The diversity of types of integrative unity once again indicates the necessity for the first principle of all to be beyond ousia. The good or one is a principle of integrated unity, and its absolute simplicity, is beyond any need for integration of parts. But for this to be more than merely notional, the good or one must be, as Plato says explicitly, the source of the being of everything that has a complexity of an existent with an essence. In eternity, endowment and achievement of integrated unity coincide. In the temporal world, where being is spread out in time and in space, integration is not inevitable, but it is the only way that the good is achievable. The third heuristic is offered in Philebus, where we learn that the good cannot be grasped on its own. So, Socrates says, if we are not able to capture the good in one idea, let us get at it with three, with beauty, symmetry, and truth, and say that we would be most correct to treat these as in a way one, and responsible for what is in the mixture of the elements in the good life, and that it is owing to this being good that it becomes so. Again, there's a great deal more to say about the passage about how beauty, symmetry, and truth together serve as a guide to the good. Here I only want to emphasize that this triad is potentially the most powerful heuristic of all in determining whether or not the good is being instantiated. It indicates implicitly integrative unity. Treat these as in a way one. But it also indicates the relational properties of truth, beauty, and symmetry. Truth is the property of being in relation to our intellects. Beauty is the property of being in relation to our desire or appetite. And symmetry is the property of being in relation to authentic imaging of it in the sensible world. Thus, in reflecting on the truth, the beauty that attracts us, and the symmetry of the parts of real images of forms, we have something like a guide to action. The above three heuristics help explain how the good is indeed the normative as well as the metaphysical foundation of Plato's system. It is perhaps worth considering, though, what options are available for reconstruction of Plato's ethics without a metaphysical foundation. I have already mentioned the pure prudentialism of Penner, which, in my view, fails to address the textual evidence for Plato and Socrates' ethical absolutism. When Socrates says at Crito 49b8 that one must in no way do injustice, he is not, I would suggest, offering a counsel of prudence. I think this is evident when Socrates confronts Callicles in Gorgias, for Callicles is more than willing to admit that just behavior is prudent for those lacking the wit or the will to dominate others. I take it that Plato's adducing the example of the tyrant or the would-be tyrant, just as it's adducing the professional sophist, is supposed to alert us to the fact that everyone, in extremis, is at least prepared to consider that he or she is an exception, and that, after all, there may be benefits to even petty tyranny. This is exactly what we find in the unnamed person at the end of Republic Book 10, who is, as Socrates says, virtuous by habit, without philosophy, anoi philosophias. He chooses the life of a tyrant, though he comes to regret it bitterly. The philosophy that he is said to be without is, of course, the philosophy that in the fifth book of the Republic is entirely concerned with perfect being, to pantelos on, and in the sixth book aims to ascend to the idea of the good in order to attain a dialectical understanding of the intelligible world. These texts, among many others, seem to me to render prudentialism in any form a dead letter insofar as Plato's ethics is concerned. To be fair, most scholars who eschew metaphysics do not embrace prudentialism. Instead, they typically try to squeeze out of the analogy between psychical health and physical health what I would call a kind of naturalistic normativity. By far, the most common interpretative approach along these lines is eudaimonism, broadly speaking. Specifically, the interpretation holds that for Plato, virtue is both necessary and sufficient for happiness. It is on this basis, of course, that scholars typically note an affinity between Platonic ethics and Stoic ethics. I do not dispute the attribution of eudaimonism to Plato. I dispute the claim that one could provide a sound argument for it while eschewing metaphysics. Moreover, and more to the point, I strenuously dispute the claim that there is no evidence in the text to support the view that this is exactly what Plato thinks. Unless the claim that virtue is a necessary and sufficient condition for happiness is taken as an empty analytic truth, one wonders how in the world Socrates or Plato could convince a Thrasymachus or a Callicles that the good they seek, the happiness they desire, could only be achieved if virtue is not regarded as one good among many, but as the only good. In other words, they have to be persuaded that the good for themselves that they admittedly seek can only possibly be achieved if they do nothing that requires privileging another good, say pleasure over virtue, not even once. By contrast, if the focus is shifted to the unhypothetical first principle of all, which as we have seen, must be apekina tes ousias, above ousia, then it follows that the good that I seek is only real and not apparent if the presence of that good is not at the same time bad for anyone else. Because the idea of the good makes virtue useful or beneficial. Virtue is the instrument of the good that is sought. That is, the good that is sought comes ultimately from the idea of the good, not from virtue. It is the idea of the good alone that guarantees the unqualified efficacy of virtue for the attainment of happiness. If this were not so, then one could allow that virtue does indeed necessarily bring a good to the soul, but that fact does not settle the question of whether the pursuit of virtue, to the exclusion of any other good, guarantees the happiness one seeks. I suppose that it is diffidence about the metaphysical foundation of Plato's ethic that leads scholars to confuse the good that virtue is with the superordinate idea of the good. Before this distinguished audience, I have a long footnote, which I wasn't going to read, but I will mention it, at least in part, because it concerns Proclus. Proclus, in his commentary on the Republic, commentary isn't exactly the right word, in his essays on the Republic, sees exactly that the superordinate idea of the good must be distinguished from a substantive good, which he calls the genus of teleoses, the genus of perfections, that includes psychical good and pleasure and physical health and friendship and all the rest. This is the generic term. But if the good, the idea of the good, had an ousia itself, then we could always ask whether possession of that was good. If, for example, the good were pleasure, and in the Philebus and in the Gorgias, the interlocutors try out this position, then it would make no sense to ask the question, is pleasure good for me? Because you would be asking the question, is pleasure pleasure? It's always possible to do so. Therefore, the good can't have a substantive nature itself. That is, it can't be an ousia. It has to be above ousia. If we approach the putative non-metaphysical ethics of Plato under the rubric of Socratic intellectualism, we attain a similarly unsatisfactory result. The hallmark of intellectualism in all its variations is that knowledge is in some sense both necessary and sufficient for virtue. Much is made of the supposed similarity between knowledge and craft, techne. So it is easy to conclude that the knowledge that the philosopher seeks and the virtuous person possesses is knowledge of good and bad. That is, knowledge of how to bring about good and avoid bad in one's actions. This interpretation draws its strength from the fact that at a superficial level, it is of course true that Plato thinks that a virtuous person will be able to bring about good and avoid bad in his life. But the interpretation begins to lose credibility when we focus on the ambiguity of good in the claim that the relevant knowledge is of this. On the one hand, if knowing how to do the virtuous thing in some circumstances what knowledge of the good amounts to, then it still leaves open the question of whether bringing about the good that the virtue is supposed to bring about is good for oneself. For example, if the knowledge is of what in a particular circumstance courage requires, this does not even begin to tell us whether it is good for me to be courageous. And remember, what I want is what's really good for me. I think that those who ignore Plato's metaphysics in promoting Socratic intellectualism simply cling to a pious and rather endearingly naive hope that the courageous will prosper and the cowardly will suffer. On the other hand, if the relevant knowledge is of what is really good for me in this circumstance, one wants to be certain that what is good for me can never be bad for anyone else. If this were not the case, then it is entirely possible that the relevant knowledge could be of how to do the vicious thing if that achieves my real good. It is only if the good that knowledge is of is made to be good by the idea of the good, which is apekine tesousias, does it follow that this is what I necessarily choose to do. That is, only if my good and the good are identical does knowledge entail virtue. This is why the mathema of the idea of the good is megaston, greatest, and why Plato imagined a decades-long education as preparatory for the attainment of this goal. This means, however, that the knowledge that is virtue is not a techne at all, which is always focused on the sensible and contingent world. On the contrary, it is just what Plato says it is, cognition of forms, which is only possible in the light of the good. This makes little sense if the good is not the one and the knowledge just the synoptic dialectic that the philosopher is supposed to practice. It is knowledge of the good, that the good is the principle of unification in all things. It is only this knowledge that makes intelligible the claim that the virtues are a unity, that apart from the mere practice of the virtues by rote or by command, all true or philosophical virtue is nothing but the manifestation of the knowledge that the good is one, and that it is not possible to attain one's own good at the expense of anyone else. Permit me one final reflection on the immense divide between those, like myself, who embrace what can accurately be called the traditional interpretation of Plato's ethics and its metaphysical foundation, and those who dismiss this view in no uncertain terms. In contemporary philosophy, experts in ethics and experts in metaphysics have little contact. It is widely assumed that these areas have only a remote connection, much like that which connects, say, ophthalmology and orthopedic surgery, namely the general principles of anatomy and physiology and so on. In this analogy, logic, or the principles of reasoning, are the remote connectors between or among the branches of philosophy. In this paper, I have not argued that this approach is false, although in fact I think it is. Nor would I argue that those who have little interest in the history of philosophy can be expected to be attuned to the existence of philosophical assumptions different from their own, especially as these are found in the distant past. But there is, I would argue, no similar excuse for those who profess ancient Greek philosophy, and especially Plato and Platonism. Plato, as his writings amply demonstrate, is innocent of any assumption of the autonomy of ethics. It certainly does not speak well of an historian of ancient philosophy to suppose otherwise, just because he or she finds it comforting or satisfying to do so. The idea of the good, or the one, is the starting point for all Plato's philosophy. I would say that this is especially true for his ethics. To suppose otherwise is to abandon oneself to one of the countless dead ends currently found in Platonic scholarship. Thank you.